Rockhounds, presented by the Danbury Library. My name is Darcy, and each month I'd like to take you on a little adventure to a place where we can find and learn about interesting rocks. This month we're going to do something a little different. We're going to go on a virtual tour. But before we do, we should review our rules that all rockhounds should know and remember. Rule number 1, we never go into the woods or strange places alone. Rule number 2, we do not go on private land without permission. Rule number 3, we do not litter and we clean up any litter we find, even if it's not ours. Rule number 4, we only take a few rocks. We leave some behind for others to find. And rule number 5, we do not remove rocks from national and state parks. It's illegal to do so. Now that we know the rules, let's start on this month's adventure. Today we're looking at the old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine. If you'd like to visit in person, it's around an hour and a half's drive from Danbury down I-84. But due to the distance, the storm we had over the weekend, and COVID increasing again, we're going to take a virtual tour. Also, I gotta admit, I'm a little uneasy about being in small, cramped tunnels underground. Old Newgate Copper Mine is the first charted copper mine on national record. Copper was first found on the site back in 1705. In 1709, John Woodbridge, Timothy Woodbridge Jr., and Dudley Woodbridge banded together to form a company. Their goal? To dig up the copper ore within the mine, refine it, and sell it for a hefty profit. The residents of the nearby town of Simsbury were invited to invest in the company and become shareholders. In total, 64 residents agreed. Using the money invested, 2 vertical shafts were dug down deep into the earth, one nearly 80 feet deep and the other 35 feet deep. At the base of the shafts, caverns and tunnels were dug, some reaching several hundred feet long in various directions, all in the hunt for the copper ore. Unfortunately for the Woodbridges and their investors, the profits from the mine were very small. It was too difficult to get the copper ore up to the surface. On top of that, British law at the time did not allow the ore to be smelted and refined here in the United States. Remember, at the time, 1700s, America was still a collection of British colonies. Since the copper couldn't be removed from the ore that had been brought to the surface here in the States, the entire mass had to be shipped over to England. And that's a lot of weight. These heavy bundles of rock were very expensive to ship. Because of this, within 4 years, the mine failed and closed down. But that wasn't the end of the mine. In 1714, Jonathan Belcher, William Partridge, and Timothy Woodbridge Jr. raised 10,000 pounds to restart the mine. Unfortunately, once again, the profits weren't enough to cover the cost and the mine closed down. Over the years, others continued to try reopening the mine because remember, there's still copper ore down in the ground there and they wanted it. But the cost of shipping kept crippling the operations and the mine never stayed open for very long. Some mine owners tried to get around this by smelting the ore here in America, which was completely illegal. And in order to do this, they had to do it in secrecy. And the cost of trying to do this secretly with no one knowing, because melting is a big operation that usually requires large buildings and a lot of heat and a lot of lumber, well, it became, again, too expensive and the mine just was not profitable. The mine was eventually abandoned as a lost cause until it became a prison in 1773. This is where the buildings on top of the mine come from. Mining began again in the 1830s and again in the 1850s, but both of these times there was again little success. As a result, the mining operation was fully abandoned in the 1850s. It became a tourist attraction in the 1860s when the current owners of the land took people down to the shafts with only candles to light the way, charging them to see the mine tunnels. Can you imagine going down here with nothing but a candle to light your way? I mean, it's kind of creepy as we're seeing it on the screen here, isn't it? And this is with electric lights. It would have been much, much darker and slippery and damp when there was no electricity to help maintain this mine. So, we said they were digging copper out of this, right? That's what everyone wanted. So what is copper? Well, copper is this stuff right here. It's that shiny bit. Can you see it? Yeah. It's kind of a reddish kind of color, isn't it? It's metallic. And it's a very important and valuable element. In fact, this is number 29 on the periodic table, and its symbol is Cu. Copper is unique. Out of all the elements that are on that periodic table, there are only 2 metallic ones that are not silvery in color. Copper is one of them, and the other one is gold. So all the rest that we have that are metallic, they have a nice silvery sheen, but it's just copper and gold that do not. And if we were to mix copper and gold, we'd get a beautiful piece of metal called rose gold, which is gold that has a nice pinkish color. It's very pretty, isn't it? Copper is one of the first metals that humans have ever worked with. That means we could easily find it in the ground lying around, and it was very easy for us to make things out of. In fact, people were using copper as far back as 10,000 years ago. Wow, that's a long time, right? Not only is copper useful for making items, our bodies need it too. See, our bodies need copper to make blood cells, and we use blood cells to travel around our body, and they carry oxygen. We need oxygen to breathe and live, right? We do. So if we don't have enough copper in our blood, well, that means we're having a hard time getting that oxygen throughout all the parts of our body. Now, luckily, this mineral is actually very easy to find in our food. A lot of the stuff that we eat naturally contains trace bits of copper. So foods like leafy greens and grains and potatoes and beans, these are all foods that we like to eat that contain bits of the elements that we need, copper. It's also found in a lot of the water that we drink naturally. And if we're still not getting enough copper in our diet, like maybe we just really don't like leafy greens and potatoes, well, we can actually take mineral supplements like vitamins that contain bits of copper that help our body keep that level to the amount we need so we can regulate and work our body properly. But the thing is, while our bodies need copper to live, not every living being on the earth actually enjoys being around copper. Copper is a natural antibacterial agent. Now, what this means is that copper is bad for bacteria. So if I've got a bacterial infection and I'm sneezing on copper, that bacteria is not going to live on this copper very long. It's going to, and it's actually going to die off. This is why a lot of the buildings that we have that are public buildings have brass handles on their doors. You're like, well, brass isn't a copper, is it? It actually is. It's a copper alloy. What they do is they mix the copper with another metal to get the brass. And the reason they do this is, first of all, the copper that's in that brass is going to make it so that if there's any bacteria on our hands and we go touching that doorknob, that bacteria is going to transfer the doorknob and it's not going to live on that surface very long. So when the next person comes and grabs the doorknob, their chances of getting a bacteria that we were carrying is pretty small. But they mix it together to get that brassy color because while copper doesn't corrode, it means it doesn't break down completely and fall apart, it will change color. As copper gets older, it actually goes a green color. So, you know the Statue of Liberty? It's green, right? Well, it didn't start out that way. It was actually this coppery color because the Statue of Liberty has copper plating on it. It does. And when she was new, she was bright and this kind of reddish coppery color. But as she aged, she turned green because that's what happens when copper oxidizes. As copper is out exposed over time, it gets that nice green color. We can also see this in old pennies. That's what happens when copper ages and oxidizes. So, since these buildings don't want green door handles, because people might go, ooh, I don't want to touch that, they mix the copper with another metal to get brass. So they still have that antibacterial agent going on from the copper, but they have a much more stable metal in the brass, so it's not going to change color. Copper is also toxic to a number of invertebrates. These are animals without spines. So many ships use copper on the hulls of the ship. That's the underside that's in the water. And they do this so things like mussels and barnacles won't attach themselves to the sides of the ship, because that can actually slow the ship down and cause corrosion over time. But that copper around there that is toxic is making these creatures go, ooh, I don't want to touch that, so they don't actually stay on the ship. Pretty cool, huh? Copper not only looks pretty, it is also a great conductor of heat and electricity. This is why some cooking pots will have bright copper bottoms, and while many electronics contain bits made from copper. So there's copper in your phone, and in your computers, and on your tablets. It's very good for conducting electricity and signals through the various parts of your machines. Copper is also used in wiring, plumbing, buildings, and in making coins. Copper is a completely recyclable element. That means if copper is pulled out of the ground and refined and used to make something else, we can just melt it down and make a whole new item without losing any of that copper. Nearly 80% of the copper that has ever been dug up and used by humans is still being used today. It's just being recycled into new equipment and new products that we can get benefits from. Thank you for joining me this month for our virtual tour of the old Newgate copper mine. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the amazing element that is copper. Until the next time we meet, happy exploring and stay curious. Bye everyone!